We're good?
Yeah, I think we're good. All right, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's Kim Gaffett here with Nature Conservancy, and we're on our midwinter Zoom with nature. And this one's going to be a little different. This is because it's so cold out. I thought it'd be a little shorter. And because it's so cold out, I think this is what I'm going to call the armchair walk, because this is in fact a walk that you really can't do because most of it is on private property, but you will get to see some really, what I find some interesting stuff. And parts of it you can get to, but I'll explain that as we go along. So to start off with, let's see if I can get my screen to advance. No, okay. Okay, what's going on here? Just starting over here. There we go. So what we're talking about today is the Cormorant. I've always called it Cormorant Swamp, and it's right in here. It's to the basically to the east of Cormorant Cove. So you get there by going down the Coast Guard Road or Champlain Road. It's known by two names. And so the main first landmark you see on Champlain Road is Champlain Pond. There's been many photos taken of this beautiful pond. And as you go down the road, the next section is actually land that is owned by the Nature Conservancy and or with easements by the Block Island Land Trust, but they do not. So that's what's outlined here. This is actually ownership. And then we'll go sort of down this private road and wind our way around to this area, which is the subject of today's walk. It's Cormorant Swamp. It's a big salt marsh. It is tidal, which you'll be seeing shortly. And it is an easement. The land is still owned by the Wadsworth family, but they gave a conservation easement for a wildlife refuge over this parcel in 1972, which is pretty long ago. This was, in fact, the first easement, we believe, on Block Island, conservation easement, and I think also in the state, as I understand it. And at the time, the Nature Conservancy didn't even have an office in Rhode Island, let alone Block Island. So the first years, it was actually, the easement was managed by the Eastern Region office, which was, I think, based in Boston. And Charlotte probably knows more about those logistics. So if I say something wrong, correct me, please. Because I've been researching this as myself, and there's plenty to learn. What's interesting about this area is that it's wet, and it's a wonderful example of a salt marsh, which is great habitat. And it actually gets fed in two directions. Fresh water comes from Champlain Pond and comes down sort of a stream, like goes under the road and comes out in here. But then there's also tidal action where the tide comes in and feeds it from this point number 2. And as usual, the numbers equate to some of the photos where I've labeled them 1, 2, and 3, where I took the photos into Cormorant Swamp or out towards Cormorant Cove. One photo you'll see, I'm about here at the corner, and then another few are down here. So this is a grassy land. So I think that's enough intro for now. But it's really interesting because of the sort of the conservation history of this parcel. And I probably say a little bit more about that in a bit. So we'll start up on Coast Guard Road, Champlain Road. And, as you have probably all seen pictures of this beautiful pond down in the big fields right below Champlain Farm. It's getting harder and harder to get a good photo of that without getting the brush. You sort of have to peer between the brush to get a photo. This was actually late afternoon. You get a sense of the late afternoon light. And here's just another view of it, trying to get a view through and next to the trees that are growing up along the side of the wall. And of course, if you look long enough, you will always find birds in there, ducks. There's a nice pair. These are a little fuzzy because there's a distance, but nice 2 pairs of hooded mergansers. And those are ducks that like both the salt and the fresh water. So they're in the right area between Champlain Pond and Cormorant Cove. Now, as I mentioned, that very first place I stopped to take pictures, and this is a kind of odd picture. It's a panorama, so it's a little warped on its perspective. But if you look off to the left, this is going parallel to the road, Champlain Road. And if you look sort of down this way, we're looking easterly, yeah. And actually the pond is, the swamp is down in this, beyond this area. But this is land that is owned by the Nature Conservancy. There aren't any paths on it. It's just open land that's kept in sort of grass and upper shrub, coastal shrub. The boundary for this lot is the fence line, unlike many boundaries on Block Island, which are the stone walls. That is not the case. This space between the stone wall and the fence line belongs to a private owner, the new owners of the Champlain Farm area. So the fence line, and that's just one of the quirks of land ownership on Block Island. So we go down the road, you change the perspective just a little bit, and now you can sort of see in the distance parts of course, these are telephoto photos. You know, I've really zoomed in as far as I could to get a sense. So it's foreshortened the view. It's a little farther than it looks. But that's looking into some of the open water of the Cormorant Swamp. Here's another view of it, really telephotoed in. And what's interesting here is you don't see it so much here, but in this part, there's a big Phragmites swamp. And then there seems to be a little road, and then it opens up into the Cormorant Swamp proper. So that's what you're seeing there. I've really focused in and picked up. Again, it's not clear because it's so zoomed in, but that's a Phragmites swamp. Of course, in this field, just like everywhere, I just happened to get this white-tailed deer, and you can tell he is looking at me as hard as I am looking at it. So now we're going to leave this area, and now we're going to focus more on, this is the parcel, and we'll be coming down this private road and coming this way to get to it. And again, this will be our first stop. Well, our first noted stop for photos. It's a very important area because of its habitat for a refuge. It's interesting that this was done in 1972 to me because of my background. The town, this is exactly the same year that the breed land on Corn Neck was given to the town, and that was named the Champlain Pond Wildlife Refuge. And there was a big effort at that time to turn several open spaces into wildlife refuges for the protection of birds and other animals. And this was one of them. I've always been interested in what this was. This was actually the first time I've explored this area in any amount of detail. And even that, because it was so wet, I couldn't do the exploration I would have liked. But it makes sense to me now that this was formed at the same time. And the first monitor of this property was Herb Whitman, and he was the first warden at the time. And he was also instrumental in advising the breeds to give their land over the town for nature wildlife refuge. And there's another small one on the south side, which I may get to another day. But again, from a sort of a history of conservation on Block Island, it was Herb Whitman who contacted the Nature Conservancy and Rob Lewis in encouraging, and that was right around the time that the Block Island Conservancy was forming. And they encouraged the Nature Conservancy, which again did not have an active presence on Block Island, to get involved with this first effort at conservation. So as we go down, this is looking northward. And again, it's a foreshortened because it's a zoomed in view, and you can tell this is I put two photos together to try to get a whole sense of the expanse. Because we're in mid-winter, there's not a lot of green to see, and so you'll see a lot of tans and grays, but some subtle colors here and there. But it's really, probably what's going to be most interesting throughout this is just the texture and the look of the landscape, such as it is. So we'll get a little closer. Oh, I wanted to, if you look, which probably, let's see if I can do it. Yeah. If you look right across it, that little dot right there, that is a great blue heron. And there it is. Again, a little fuzzy, but there it was, hunkered down that particular day. And actually to the tree right to the left of this was a, I could not get that at all, was a belted kingfisher. So again, great bird life even in January. And then here's another closer picture of great blue heron from a different angle. So as we go, so on the, we're right now, I'm sort of exploring a little bit of the the southern edge. And this is sort of a wetter area. It's with more what we would call emergent vegetation, open water, grasses and reeds coming in, some bigger things along the side. And in this, again, I'm peering through some vegetation, but to my side is this big tree. Okay, so the wetland area that I was just looking at was in here. But these are some vegetation you often see coming in at the edge of wetlands. This is a weeping willow, and this time of year they start to get this wonderful sort of yellow cast. It's one of the first things, buds, that you start to see coming out. Weeping willows love to be, they suck up a lot of water. So if you have, a big wet spot in your land and you'd like to plant something to help take up that water without trying to drain it off, plant a weeping willow, because that will thrive and it will take up a certain amount of water from the surface. Next to it was this holly. And again, you can see the water in the background. Hollies don't need quite as much water, but I have found that the American holly, this time of year, because it is evergreen, you can see it a lot more. I think it's in the brush more than we think on Block Island, but when you're walking around the island, lots of places you find little small hollies growing in, and their seeds seem to be taking off. This part of the island, Coast Guard Road, basically the west edge between Coast Guard Road and Dory's Cove, in the pathways, you can find a lot of little hollies growing in. And recently when we were at Robbins Hollow, we saw the same thing. So there is seed stock in the area, and they're coming in. Beautiful tree once you get it established. Another thing that's growing up that you can see on the side of this little emergent wetland that's leading into the swamp is a sweet pepper bush. This is a wonderful late summer blooming plant that's always very fragrant, white, big white stalks of flowers, but always with their roots in the water, very near the water's edge. And these are, of course, the dried seed pods, but they're very distinctive to know. Even though they're not in bloom, I know that this was a big stand of sweet pepper bush. Okay, so now we're moving along to the spot that was number one, looking into the swamp. And as you can see, it's in two different times. I just love, again, the patterns and the textures of the water. This was a day that it happened to be a little colder, and thus the ice left behind. And this is the first hint that you get that perhaps this is a tidal marsh. That when you see this along the edge of any tidal area where the tide comes in, floods, and then if it's very cold as it goes out, the ice stays behind and covers the edges. So that's our first hint. And if you look a little closer, into what we're seeing. Most of this marsh has Spartina alterniflora, which is the saltwater marsh cordgrass. It's ubiquitous on all saltwater marshes. It is the main sort of colonizing and establishing piece of vegetation. Its roots are rhizomous, and they'll connect to each other in the silt of the tides and the water running through, collect in those roots and build up a mat, and eventually will, build up solid ground. But almost all of the center part of Cormorant Swamp is Spartina, and at the upper end, because I wasn't in there looking too closely, there may be some of the others, more dry land, less saltwater species of Spartina. But Spartina has 3 different species, and it all depends on how salty the water is. And the most salt, the one closest to the salt water is Spartina alterniflora, the marsh cordgrass. And that's almost what everything in this swamp is, except for the edges. You can see Phragmites and cattails growing up, much more Phragmites, and they're known by this big plume head. Wherever you see Phragmites, you know that there is fresh water. So you wouldn't see Phragmites out in the middle of this because it's too salty, but around the edges where fresh water, especially in the upland edge towards Champlain Pond, farm and pond, is where you start to see the big sort of congregations of Phragmites, again, because of the need for fresh water. And then also cattails, which is really a wonderful, these are both grasses, by the way. And cattail is the native grass for a wetland, not the Phragmites. And it can, a nice cattail marsh can be overtaken by Phragmites, which is unfortunate. And I only saw very few stalks of cattails when I was out exploring this area. By far, most of the edges are Phragmites. So it's, again, it's a wildlife refuge. It's sort of like looking into Champlain Pond. It's kind of hard to find a spot where you can see through. But if you look back in here and you get your zoom lens on, you can see that it's really a real rich area for bird life, especially ducks. This is a wonderful area for ducks if you happen to be lucky enough to sneak up on them before they fly away. They're very spooky. So there are many pictures of ducks that I did not get. A lot of mallards in here, but on this particular day, I also saw a gadwall and Canada geese, and that's all I can remember at the moment. I thought there may have been a pintail, but I couldn't, it didn't stay long enough to find out. There's probably a widgeon in there as well, I think, now that I look at it. Anyway, it's a great place for ducks. There's lots of vegetation on the bottom of the water for the dabbling ducks, and lots of seeds coming off of the Phragmites, and lots of protection. It is, after all, a wildlife refuge. So as we go along, our next spot, and we'll actually come back to this afterwards, but this is the area where the swamp flows through a culvert underneath the road here. And again, we're looking into the marsh in these views, trying to get a sense of what's in there. And it's a lot of ducks, and I would love to get in here in the late spring and see what kind of other plants are growing. Again, here's a close-up. I actually love this because of the sort of the gradations of vegetation. You have this cordgrass hummock, and lots of them throughout, and then more of this cordgrass or Spartina layered in, and then the Phragmites on the back edge, and then above that the coastal shrub vegetation. So these are the 3 predominant sort of zones of vegetation in this area. and between the shrublands producing all things like shad and bayberry, cherry, and high bush blueberry, lots of fruit produced for birds, and then the same thing with the cordgrass and the water. So go a little farther, and I don't suggest anybody do this. On this road, you come to sort of the other edge of the pond or swamp, trying to look in. And again, you just see more of the same, that wonderful pattern of sort of hummocks and islands and peninsulas of cordgrass into the water, and lots of vegetation. It's about 7.5 acres of just open space for the benefit of wildlife. Pretty amazing. And then again, just a little close up hidden in there. I think you can sort of make it out right about there is this duck. I believe that was a mallard. And they go just a little further. And again, you're peeking through the trees and looking back sort of in the direction from whence we came. Again, this is, you cannot go here. This is private property, the land that I'm standing on. So I was admittedly trespassing. But as we go along, again, I mentioned the shrubs, the coastal shrubs. This is a really wonderful bush, the high bush blueberry. This, again, is found only where its feet or its roots can be wet. So it's usually at the edge of a swamp or a pond or a wetland of some sort. There's quite a bit of it ringing this marsh area. And it has a very distinctive form. It grows sort of in a clump out of a center area, and the branches generally are crooked. They're just, and I always think of the old kid's tale, the crooked man and his crooked stick and his crooked dog. This is just a crooked shrub. But as you get first you notice the form, and again, here's another of it, again coming out of a center part, and then going off in all directions, sort of like a big hair tangle. And once you start looking at the bark, again, all tangled and crooked looking, you start to see sort of the texture of it. Plus it has a very reddish, kind of a reddish hue. And this is all the distinctive markings of the high bush blueberry, which does produce wonderful blueberries. They're kind of small. And I challenge anyone to find a high bush blueberry and get the berries before the birds. Because I know there's one right near my bird banding nets, and I've seen the berries, but I've never seen them ripe. They go right away. They seem to come and become ripened just as the time that the catbirds are here, ready to try to feed their young. So, but it's a beautiful plant to look at, and it's a native, and it always makes me happy to see it thriving at the edge of the island's wetlands, including this marsh. Now we're gonna, along this path, which is elevated a little bit is higher than sea level, I found these two very interesting things. One, a moon snail shell. So this had to be carried here probably by a gull, dropped. And in the middle of January, one blooming dandelion right in the center of the path. So hardy stock. So now we're going back to the area where the culvert was, and I just want to show a little bit about how tidal this actually is. This is at low tide, and notice the undercut here and the exposed surface here. This rock is largely out of the water, and then when the water started flooding in, and then when it was at closer to high tide, you notice the water has risen and it's not so undercut. The area where there was exposed mud is covered now. And this rock, although it's not quite in the image, is about half covered up with water. So this is definitely a tidal marsh. It's amazing how much water flows. And yesterday, when things were starting to freeze up, I happened to be down there, and this is the only area really that had open water. and there were probably 150 or more different species of ducks in there. Not 150 species, 150 ducks of different species, most of which were mallard, black duck, and gadwall. And there were probably lots of others, but those are the only ones I can really identify with any confidence when they're on the wing, which is what they were. But by the time I got a clear view, they were in the sky. So felt a little bad disturbing their morning breakfast. If you go to the other side of the road, so that water is flowing. You stand on the road and there's a culvert under the road, so that takes the water in and out of the previous photos showed where the water's coming in and out of the swamp. Under the road, the culvert comes out, and then this is where the water comes out. And again, this is at low tide, and the culvert's right about here, and it's all exposed. And then this is high tide, and here's the culvert right here. And water is flooding in on this one and flowing out on this one. And then a little bit closer, again, you can see here, real close up of the culvert where there is low tide. Water is dribbling out. It's almost at the bottom of the culvert opening, and here it is just flowing in like crazy. And these were medium tides. These were not extreme tides. I'd be interested to go back and look at these at well, it'd be hard to look at them at a very high tide, but to look at it at a very low tide to see if water is even actually coming out. And this is on the Great Salt Pond side. This is in Cormorant Cove. So since according to state law, everything below a mean high water is public. You can go and look at the culvert from the water side. You may have to duck under a few docks to get there, but you have every right to do that. And there we find ourselves back on Cormorant Cove, and in the sand. And there was most of the birds were quite far out, but I did see evidence of two species at least. Here they happen to be side by side, and this one is just this wonderful pattern of. And I'm not sure what this is. This is it's not a duck or a gull, which I'm sure this is a gull with its webbed feet. This is more of a shorebird type pattern. It's not tiny, but it's not as big as a great blue heron. So I'm guessing it's probably a black-bellied plover, which is really the only shorebird that's here right now. But I'm not positive. It's a nice scallop shell to give you sort of a perspective of the size of these particular footprints. Sometimes you just have to leave the mystery there. Of course, Cormorant Point is that point that jumps out. So we've got Cormorant Point, we've got Cormorant Cove, we've got Cormorant Swamp, and the refuge itself is called the Cormorant Point Wildlife Refuge. And that point, usually there is in fact a cormorant or several cormorants on these rocks, not on this particular day, but this time of year, it's a wonderful place for the seals to hang out. These are mostly harbor seals, a little bit smaller face and a little bit smaller bodies. So good place to go seal watching this time of year. Other critters in the Cormorant Cove side of this would be the gray seal, and this was a gray seal. I almost got it in a great shot sitting on the dock, but in fact, he decided to get out of there, and he was just plopping into the water when I got this photo. And by the time I tried to take a second photo, it was in the water. But he'd been out for a while. You can see that his fur looks pretty dry, and it's amazingly brown. But that long face, that long snout tells me, and I had a better look at it before it started to escape, but that is definitely a gray seal, which is the bigger seal that we see around here. Also wonderfully brown, the common eider, lots of common eider in this area. I just happen to really enjoy this beautiful picture of the female common eider and that sort of golden brown color. What else do we have here? This was washed up in Cormorant Cove just last weekend. It is a common dolphin. It's probably an older one. It is a male. We don't know the cause of death or why it showed up. It was pretty fresh. The eye the eye is usually the first thing that would be eaten away. The eye was still very, very present. Beautiful animal. And yesterday or the day before yesterday, somebody reported another dead common dolphin on the beach going out Sandy Point. So I hope that's a coincidence, but those have been reported to the Mystic Aquarium, and they will hopefully, decide whether or not it needs further investigation. Other sightings around the island in January where I didn't get a good picture of a cormorant while I was at Cormorant Wildlife Refuge, so I better try to get one inland. And this is a pair of great cormorants sitting on a rock in a freshwater pond on the island. And other wonderful sightings, the sort of wonderful colors of January, red and gray. And this is a tree that's a winterberry that is still filled with red berries. And of course, winterberry is in the ilex family, the holly family. So you can see the resemblance between those berries and holly. And this northern mockingbird has found a place to feast, at least for a couple of weeks, because there are a lot of berries in this tree. And I've been back to this site which a few times, and every time in the morning I go when the sun is hitting that front of that, there is northern mockingbird eating winterberries. So it'd be interesting to see how long it takes for that tree to have no more berries. So let's see what's next. Our bird list. It was an interesting day because the day I went and one of the days I went and took stock of the birds. I saw the gadwall and the mallard and the black duck all in the pond. On the ocean, on the Great Salt Pond side, there's a common goldeneye, the eider, and the great blue heron, northern harrier, flying over the marsh, which was wonderful. It's one of the species that was targeted when protecting that parcel. And the belted kingfisher was definitely hanging out. Every time I went there, I either saw or heard it. So it was hanging out fishing in the marsh. So with that, I will take questions and hopefully have a little conversation. I know this is a little shorter than our walks, but because you can't walk there.
Sorry, Kim, I muted you by accident. Sorry.
That's okay. Let's see. I was just saying it was a little shorter walk than usual, but it's a good time for an indoor walk talk on Block Island. And with that, happily take questions or conversation. And I will. Let's see. Shall I stop sharing the screen?
Sure, Kim. I think everyone can now. I wanted to unmute everybody, but it looks like I muted everybody. So I think now people can unmute themselves. But there was a bit of a conversation in the chat about some water. Hold on, let me get the chat up. Where is the chat? Like George mentioned about that water sampling and testing is done at this Culvert site from May to October by the Committee of the Great Salt Pond and the URI Watershed Watch.
Right.
And then Trudy kind of asked a question about it. Does the water testing indicate about water testing indicate about the health of the water at that location? So I don't know if George would.
Well, let me say a few things, and then George can add in there if he wants. That has been tested for many years, not just by the committee, but also by the town and through DEM. And for quite a while, that was one of the areas that you would on occasion get what's called a high fecal coliform count. And there's some concern about where that was and what effect it would have. So they would close the shell fishing in Cormorant Cove. Now, when the cows used to graze up on Champlain Farm, and of course what's so interesting about this whole area is that that whole hillside, including the Champlain Pond and the farm, when it was a farm, and the hillside where the Nature Conservancy now owns the land, that is all part of the watershed that's leading down into the marsh and then out the culvert. So when it had cows, it was believed that they were contributing quite a bit to the possibility of fecal coliform coming into and out of that marsh. Of course, what the real concern was it that, or was it that, or was it one of the many septic systems in the area? There are many houses in this area right between the marsh and the Great Salt Pond, which is not a very big area, which I would be hard pressed to think that would be allowed to be built in this day and age. But they're all older, and so they have to be very careful of monitoring their septic systems. It's my understanding, and George can confirm me, but confirm this or not, that for the most part, the testing is proving to be very good in recent years since the cows are gone. And they have opened up Great Salt Pond, Cormorant Cove, to shellfishing in the summer. There was a time, and George can answer this, that a small area off of the culvert was off limits for shellfishing, but it was relatively small area. And I think it was more out of abundance of caution. But George, you want to add into that?
Well, you're absolutely right. That small area was cordoned off for quite some time. And I had the good fortune to get there right after it had been opened a few years ago. And that was some very good clamming. It was quite by accident. We do test it. The water quality there is good. I was trying to find the link to the data. There on the URI Watershed Watch website, if you drill down in there, there's actually a summary of Block Island data for the Great Salt Pond stretching back 20 years. And they have it all in a fairly large file. And it varies from month to month, from year to year. Sometimes you get a little bit of bad data in there, at least data that's not encouraging, but usually it's good. I'm trying to find that link now, no success. If I do find it, maybe I can send it along and we can post it for another time.
Sure. And I like to just remind, fecal coliform is an indicator. It makes you want to look further. It's not necessarily a bad, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's pollution there. It can mean that you just happen to sample where the goose just left its droppings. So when you see that, you really have to see if there's a trend and not react too badly, too quickly or too extremely if you get a bad, a high count. It's not even necessarily bad, but a high count once in a while. So.
No, thanks, Kim.
Yep.
Kim, John Formica, thank you for doing these. I love them, especially this time of year.
Great.
Always very entertaining and informational. The question I had was, over time, will the connection from the swamp to the ocean on the westerly side, have a sand issue that'll build up and clog the connection?
I don't think so. For one thing, if there was going to be I guess it could, if we had sea level rise at a significant amount, which wouldn't have to be that much, but because humans have built that road in there, there'll be an inclination to maintain that road. So if you were to take human activity out, you could, sea level rise may affect that. But as much as there is salt water, tidal water flowing in there, there's a lot of fresh water coming out of that watershed and out of that bank. And this particular part of the island has a lot of fresh water. It's very sandy substrate in general. Some of the best water in the island comes from between Coast Guard Road and leading up to that side of Beacon Hill. And it's it's largely bank mud gravel. Other parts of the island have a lot of clay and minerals in the soil, so it's very rusty. But on that side, that part of the island, it's generally clean water and a lot of it. It's flowing out all the time. Not too far from the spot, just to the I have trouble with my direction sometimes. The west of Champlain's Marina, there's a place where water runs out of there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has forever. And it's an area that's called Dick Springs, used to be owned by Dick Dodge, who was from Deadeye Dick's. And that water used to, probably still does, but it did used to feed Champlain's Marina and would be piped all the way down towards the Narragansett. That doesn't happen anymore. So the fact that there's so much groundwater seeping out, you could have as much erosion force from the upland and the freshwater as you could have infiltration from the saltwater, and probably more. So the downhill travel of silt would probably tend to bank it up, as it has naturally. I mean, if you look at the topography, it's one thing I would love to actually have is a giant topographic map of Block Island that got rid of all the vegetation and all the coverage, so you could see. It's an amazing undulating system, all based, the island landscape in general, all based on where the glacier left debris. And Cormorant Point, if you go up from that point, you're at a little precipice. You're, 30 feet above sea level. And if you were, and I'm not saying I did, but if you were to go around the east edge of Cormorant Marsh, you would see there's a very narrow area between a drop to the bank that you cannot get down. I mean, again, it's 20 to 30 feet to the coast on the Great Salt Pond, and an equally huge drop down towards the swamp. And it's sort of like this little land bridge that goes along that western edge of the Great Salt Pond, which makes for an amazing topography. So, I mean, I think it depends on what time frame you're talking about. If you're talking about geologic time, sure, it's going to change. But I think even if we stopped, even if the road, I'm not sure the road was actually built up, but the culvert was definitely put in place so that the water wasn't running through. So you could get to that next parcel, which does have a house on it, 2 houses, 2 homes on it. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it sure rambled on a bit. Sorry.
Kim, one person asked if you know the age of the culvert.
I believe it was 1970. If I
70, okay, right before.
The documents I was reading was 1970. So,
okay.
And that's only referenced because I was looking at the easement for this, and it talked about the structures on the land, which includes a garage for one of the parcels that's not in the easement, and the fact that there was a culvert, and that now whether or not there was another version before that, this is a real, cement, you saw it was round culvert that would have been sort of technically put in place. Block Islanders, there's lots of more running water and streams than people know of because we don't see them because of the vegetation. And a lot of times the old farmers and the people who lived here before we were a tourist destination in the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, they built lots of stone bridges over land to get from one part of their land and fields to another, whether for carts or driving animals, etc. So I don't know the age of the 2 homes that are built up there, if they were 1970 or before, but the culvert was put in 1970, apparently.
Okay, great. And there was another comment in the chat I just wanted to follow up. Martha Rice mentioned, though, that is private property, about trespassing, but TNC does have the right to monitor that property, and it is done annually. Annually, we have certain points along that road that we take pictures and make sure the intent of the easement has been upheld. So, anyone else have any questions? or comments? Just unmute yourself if you do. I don't think I can unmute everybody.
I have to say that this was an area I've always wanted to explore. So even though I was hoping, the reason I put it in January was because I figured it'd be the coldest part of the year and it would be frozen enough that I might get a chance to traverse out onto the marsh and sort of see if I could get a different sense of different vegetation, which I probably wouldn't be because it would be died back. But it's been a warm winter so far, and there's not able to get out there. Of course, all it does is make me want to go there now in the spring when things are growing and to see if there's any orchids in there, which would be a pretty good area for orchids along the upper edge because of the habitat and the water and the protection. Also, there's probably lots of, I would think, irises and I don't know if there's. I don't think it is still enough to be acidic enough to have things like sundews and other more bog-like plants, but it should be interesting to find out. And the Nature Conservancy does have the right as part of the easement to do some research, which as far as I know hasn't been done yet. And I don't know if I get another down summer, maybe I'll have to see what I can do. Get a canoe out there. I think that's Trudy. Is that Trudy?
Yes, it is. Kim, I was surprised when you said Phragmite did better with fresh water.
Mm-hmm.
I'd always thought of those plants at Scotch Beach parking lot and Mosquito Beach as Phragmite, but
Yep.
I started that being saltwater more than fresh.
So that's what's really interesting about it. It has extreme high tolerance for salt water. And it can be in salt water, but it must have some fresh water associated with it. So in Scotch Beach and Mosquito Beach, there's got to be an influx of fresh water to be supporting it at least a little bit. And if you you might remember this, if you walk around the perimeter of the island on the beaches, there are many places that you come and you'll find a little stand of Phragmites.
Yeah.
And right on the shoreline, and it's not getting inundated so much with the ocean. But if you look where that is, it's almost always where there's a freshwater seep coming out of the bluff edge. So it can grow in salt water, but it must have a little fresh water to the balance has to be just right. So. And it could be that, I mean, I hope the Phragmite stays at bay. And from looking, I was able to look at the photos in the monitoring record that Charlotte and Scott have been doing all these years. And the Phragmite hasn't encroached that much. It's in the, it seems to be more in the western edge. And it's actually not in, it's on land that's not in the easement. And it has not encroached that much into the marsh. So it does make me wonder, you know, there must be either a invisible barrier where the salt fresh ratio is limiting it to the edge, or the other hypothesis would be that Spartina is so thick and sort of so dominant that it doesn't allow for the intrusion of the Phragmites. Of course, these are all sort of biological, ecological questions that a good PhD student could take on.
Thanks.
Yeah. How's everybody doing in this winter day?
A thumbs
Pat
up.
Taylor, hi. I can't see everybody, but I can see if as many as my screen will allow. So I'm trying to see who we have here, but
it's a great way to start the week. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to hear that. And
I'm looking forward to part 2 when you get back to the Cormorant Swamp in the spring.
yeah,
Definitely a follow-up. You need a sequel, Kim. Definitely a sequel. Yeah. And so, Kim, the next one, I was thinking that when you show the seals, it's just going to focus on seals.
Right.
And that is, I want to say it is a
February
Wednesday.
10th?
I want to say the
February
10th,
10th.
but
Yeah, February 10th.
yep.
that's
So
right.
that'll be our
Great.
next one, February 10th.
Yep.
And
And again, if you weren't here on one of the last two, just so you know, we've started doing these twice a month. One is more like a walk, although this was a little hybrid like, and one is going to be more sort of subject dependent. So we did ducks, a big concentration on ducks a couple of weeks ago. And then the next one will be a concentration on seals and different seal types on Block Island, and where they are and why we study them and why they're here. And if I
great.
can answer all those, I'll get a pay raise.
And it looks like George just shared that link
Yeah.
for the data from the URI Watershed Watch. So
Mhm.
so with that, I think unless people have more questions, I think it's a wrap for today, Kim, huh?
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
It's great.
everybody.
Bye.
Really
Thank
informative.
you.
Say that again.
Really informative. Thank you.
Oh,
Oh,
great.
thank you. I thought you said something else. Thank you.